teen girl collapsed outside his cabin, then whispered, "They're coming for me." What if the walls a man builds to keep the world out are the very ones that trap him in his own grief? What if the only thing that can break them down is the desperate plea of a stranger, a child knocking on the door in the middle of a storm? This is a story about Jonah, a man who had made a covenant with silence, and Lyra, a girl running from a darkness that had a name and a face. He opened his door to save her from the blizzard, but in the quiet shelter of his home, she would end up saving him from himself. The wind was a hungry wolf, clawing at the stone and timber of Jonah's cabin, its howl a lament for all the things lost to the unforgiving mountain. For 5 years, Jonah had welcomed that sound. It was a noise that filled the silence his family had left behind, a constant, raging reminder of the chaos that had stolen them from him. His world was this one room, the scent of pine and old grief, the warmth of a fire he fed not for comfort, but out of a grim, mechanical necessity. He had come to this isolated peak to die, not in body, but in soul. To let the memories of his wife's smile and his daughter's laughter be scoured away by the wind until nothing remained but a hollow man in a stone shell. That night the storm was a living thing, a furious entity of ice and fury. It was the kind of storm that erased trails, buried landmarks, and made the world outside a churning vortex of white. He was stoking the fire, his movements slow and deliberate, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, not the shriek of the wind, not the groan of the roof under the weight of the snow. It was a frantic, muffled thud against his door. Once, twice, he froze, his hand tightening on the iron poker. No one came to this place. No trapper, no prospector, no lost soul was foolish enough to challenge this ridge in winter. He stood, his heart a slow, heavy drum in his chest, and listened. The thudding came again, weaker this time, followed by a sound so faint it was almost stolen by the wind. A voice, a girl's voice, cracked and desperate. He did not want to open the door. The world outside held nothing for him but pain. The person on the other side was trouble, a complication, a crack in the tomb he had so carefully constructed. But then he remembered his own daughter Anna, her face small and pale in the final days of the fever. He remembered the promise he had made to her, a whispered vow to a dying child that he would always be a good man, even when it hurt. Cursing himself, the storm, and the ghost of his own conscience, he strode to the door, unlatched the heavy bolt, and pulled it open. A whirlwind of snow and ice blasted into the room, and with it, a small figure collapsed across the threshold. It was a girl, no older than 16, her face blue with cold, her clothes thin and tattered. Snow was caked in her dark hair, and her hands were raw and bare. She was a frozen bird, fallen from a violent sky. He dragged her inside, slamming the door against the storm's fury. He carried her to the hearth, her body shockingly light in his arms. She was unconscious, her breathing a shallow, rattling whisper. He worked with a grim efficiency born of old, painful memories. He stripped away her frozen clothes, wrapped her in the thickest wool blanket he owned, and began to rub her frozen hands and feet, trying to force life back into them. Hours passed. He forced warm broth between her lips, a drop at a time. He sat by her side, feeding the fire, listening to the twin sounds of the howling wind and her ragged breathing. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the shuttered window, she stirred. Her eyes, a deep stormy blue, fluttered open. They were filled with a profound and terrifying fear. She tried to speak, her voice a raw croak. He leaned closer to hear her. "They're coming for me," she whispered, her eyes wide with a horror that had nothing to do with the cold. Then, She slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving Jonah alone with her words, a chilling promise of a different kind of storm yet to come. The girl, who he learned was named Lyra, slept for nearly 2 days. It was a deep, exhaustive sleep, the kind that follows a body's brush with death. Jonah watched over her, his routine disrupted, his fortress of solitude breached. He felt like a man whose carefully ordered life had been invaded by a fledgling, a fragile creature that he was now inexplicably responsible for. He found himself moving more quietly, banking the fire so it wouldn't hiss and crackle too loudly, his heavy boots treading softly on the floorboards. These were considerations he hadn't made for anyone in 5 years, and the strangeness of it sat uneasily in his chest. When she finally woke for good, the fear was still there in her eyes, a wild, hunted look. She sat bolt upright, clutching the blanket to her chin, her gaze darting around the cabin as if searching for an escape route. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice stronger now, but still trembling. "My cabin," he answered from his chair by the fire. He didn't move, keeping his posture non-threatening. "You collapsed at my door during the storm." "The storm," she repeated, her eyes going to the window, where the world was still a maelstrom of white. "How long?" 2 days. She absorbed this, her knuckles white on the blanket. "Who are you?" "Jonah." He offered nothing more. His name was a stone, hard and unadorned. She watched him, assessing him with an intensity that belied her age. He could see the conflict in her face. He was her rescuer, but he was also a stranger, a large bearded man in a remote cabin. He was a potential threat. He understood her caution. He felt it himself. This girl was a mystery, a whisper of a threat. "They're coming for me," that he had foolishly let into his home. He rose and ladled some venison stew into a bowl. He set it on the small table, along with a cup of water and a piece of hard bread. "Eat," he said, his voice a gruff command. It was easier to give orders than to offer comfort. Lyra hesitated, then slowly, cautiously, she swung her legs out of the bed. She was wearing one of his old flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times, the hem falling to her knees. She moved to the table and ate, her movements stiff and sore, but her appetite fierce. They existed in this state of wary truce for days. The storm outside raged on, trapping them in the small firelit space. She did not offer her story, and he did not ask for it. He learned things about her not from words, but from actions. He learned she was proud when she insisted on washing her own bowl and cup, her small hands moving with a practiced efficiency. He learned she was resilient when he saw her testing her own weight on her frost-nipped feet, her face tight with pain, but her eyes determined. He learned she was observant, her gaze missing nothing, from the way he organized his tools on the wall to the small, faded photograph of a woman and a child he kept on the mantel, turned face down. One afternoon, she stood before that photograph. She didn't touch it, but he saw her looking at its back, at the outline of the frame. "She was beautiful," Lyra said softly, though she couldn't have seen the image. "Your wife." Jonah's gut tightened. "Her name was Elspeth," he said, his voice like gravel. "The child was Anna." He didn't know why he told her. He hadn't spoken their names aloud to another soul since he had buried them. Lyra turned to him, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. It was empathy, a deep, sorrowful understanding that was far too old for her young face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He just grunted in response and turned back to sharpening his axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel, a familiar barrier against emotion. But the barrier had been breached. She had spoken his grief into the room, giving it a name and a presence. The silence that fell between them afterwards was different. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who recognized the mark of loss on each other. Two survivors sharing a single, small pocket of warmth against a vast and unforgiving wilderness. The storm broke on the fifth day, its fury spent. It left behind a world transformed, a landscape of impossible beauty and profound silence. The snow was a thick, pristine blanket, swallowing sound, smoothing the harsh edges of the rock, and burying the world Jonah knew under a layer of pure white. When he opened the cabin door, the air that rushed in was sharp and clean, so cold it burned the lungs. Lyra stood behind him, her breath a cloud of mist in the frigid air. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the wilderness seemed to stun her into silence. The peaks of the surrounding mountains were like white-fanged gods, indifferent and ancient. "I've never seen so much quiet," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Jonah nodded. "The mountain has its own way of speaking. You just have to learn its language." That day, he took her outside. Her own clothes were ruined, so he had found a pair of his late wife's trousers and a heavy wool coat in a trunk at the foot of his bed. The clothes were too big for her, but they were warm. He taught her how to walk in the deep snow with snowshoes he had fashioned from bent wood and leather straps. Her first steps were clumsy, awkward, but she learned quickly, a determined set to her jaw. He showed her how to identify animal tracks in the fresh snow, the delicate print of a fox, the heavy tread of a deer, the unmistakable ominous track of a wolf pack. "Everything out here leaves a sign," he told her, his voice gruffly instructive. "You need to learn to read them. It'll tell you what's coming long before you see it." He was teaching her about survival in the wild, but he was also, in his own way, trying to understand the signs she had left. "They're coming for me." The words echoed in his mind. Who were they? And why were they after a slip of a girl who looked like she couldn't harm a fly? He found his answer, or at least a clue, later that week. He had given her a small knife and a block of wood to whittle, something to keep her hands busy. He had expected a crude, misshapen object, but as he watched her by the firelight, her small hands moving with a surprising, innate skill, a familiar shape began to emerge. It was a bird, its head cocked, its wings half spread, almost identical to the small carvings his daughter Anna used to make. He kept them in a small wooden box on the mantel. Lyra worked with a focused intensity, her tongue caught between her teeth, her brow furrowed. When she was done, she held it up, a sad, confused look on her face. "I don't know why I made this," she said, her voice puzzled. My hands remembered how." Jonah felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He walked to the mantel, picked up the box and opened it. He laid Anna's small carved birds on the table next to the one Lyra had just made. They were nearly perfect matches. Lyra stared at the collection of birds, her eyes wide. A flicker of something, a shadow of a memory, crossed her face. "My father," she breathed. "He taught me. He was a woodcarver." It was the first piece of her past she had recovered. The memory seemed to unlock others. She remembered a workshop filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish. She remembered a gentle man with kind hands and a soft voice. Then, the memory soured. She remembered a fire, shouting, the smell of smoke and fear. The memory ended there, a door slamming shut in her mind. She looked at Jonah, her face pale, tears welling in her eyes. "Something terrible happened," she whispered. "I don't know what, but it's why I ran." Jonah looked at the small, perfect bird in her hand, then at the collection his own daughter had made. He had taken this girl in to save her from the storm, but he was beginning to realize the storm was the least of her troubles. He was sheltering a girl who was not just lost but hunted, a girl whose past was a dangerous, burning secret. and by giving her refuge, he had painted a target on his own back. The quiet, empty life he had chosen was over. The mountain's silence had been broken, and something was coming. He could feel it, just as surely as he could read the tracks in the snow. As the snow hardened and the days grew longer, a fragile domesticity settled over the cabin. It was a life measured in simple, shared tasks. Jonah would hunt, his rifle shots echoing clean and sharp in the cold air, and return to find a fire burning and the cabin filled with the scent of baking bread. Lyra, it turned out, had a knack for it, a skill resurrected from her buried past. She would watch him skin a rabbit or clean a fish, her expression serious and focused, learning without asking. In return, she brought a quiet order to the cabin's interior, mending his worn clothes with a skill that spoke of a gentle upbringing. They rarely spoke of the future, and she never again mentioned the fragmented memory of the fire. It was an unspoken agreement to live only in the present, in this small, protected bubble of existence. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. It arrived in the form of an old trapper named Jedediah, a man as weathered and tough as the mountains themselves. Jonah saw him coming from a long way off, a lone figure moving steadily up the trail. Jonah met him outside, his hand resting casually on the axe handle at his belt, positioning himself so the cabin door was out of Jed's line of sight. "Jonah," the old trapper grunted, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Thought that storm might have finally buried you." "Not yet, Jed," Jonah replied, his voice flat. "What brings you up this high?" "Looking for a stray martin line and bringing news." Jed shifted his pack. "There's a man down in Redemption asking questions. A rich fella from the east. Name of Croft. Silas Croft." A cold stillness fell over Jonah. "He's looking for his niece, a young girl, ran off a few weeks back. Says she's troubled in the head, offering a handsome reward for her return. No questions asked." Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "Seems a bit too eager to find her, if you ask me. A man that rich, with that much steel in his eyes. He ain't looking to rescue her. He's looking to reclaim property." Jonah's face was a mask of stone. "Did he have a description?" "Dark hair, blue eyes, about so high," Jed said, gesturing to his own shoulder. "Calls her Lyra." The name hung in the air between them. Jonah's blood ran cold. He had seen the fear in her eyes, heard her desperate whisper. Now that fear had a name, Silas Croft. "Haven't seen anyone," Jonah said, his voice level. Jed looked at him, his gaze sharp and knowing. The old trapper had lived in the mountains long enough to read men, as well as he read tracks. He glanced toward the cabin, noted the faint curl of smoke from the chimney, a bit too thin for just one man's fire. He saw the way Jonah was standing, a subtle but clear defensive posture. Jed just nodded slowly. "Well, if you do, you be careful, son. That man ain't just carrying money. He's carrying a darkness that would freeze hell over." Jed adjusted his pack and turned to leave. "Reward's $500, by the way, enough to make a desperate man do a desperate thing." He didn't look back as he descended the trail. Jonah stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. $500. It was a fortune. It was enough to turn any neighbor, any desperate soul, into a bounty hunter. He went back inside. Lyra was standing by the window, her face pale. She had heard everything. "Lyra," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. She flinched, as if the name itself was a blow. "That's what he calls me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My uncle." The walls of their safe, small world had just crumbled. The threat was no longer a vague "they." It was a man, Silas Croft, and he was getting closer. The hunt was on. He could see the terror in her eyes, the hunted look returning. He crossed the room and did something he hadn't done in 5 years. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comfort, of alliance. "He won't find you," Jonah said, his voice a low, steady promise. "This is my mountain. He is not welcome here." Lyra looked up at him, her blue eyes swimming with unshed tears. She saw not a gruff recluse, but a protector, a guardian. She nodded, a single sharp gesture of trust. In that moment, they ceased to be a man and a girl thrown together by chance. They became partners in a dangerous conspiracy. The coming of Silas Croft was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and they would face it together. The knowledge that her uncle was actively hunting her changed everything. The fragile peace of the cabin evaporated, replaced by the grim tension of a coming war. Lyra's nightmares returned, haunted by the smell of smoke and the image of a cold, smiling face. She would wake with a choked cry, and Jonah would be there, sitting in his chair by the dying fire, a silent sentinel watching over her. He never offered empty words of comfort. Instead, he would simply stoke the fire, the quiet, practical action, a reassurance in itself. He was there. She was not alone. Their days became a series of drills. He took her deeper into the mountains, showing her the hidden game trails, the caves that could serve as shelters, the secret springs that never froze. "If he comes and I'm not here," he told her, his voice grim, "or if we get separated, you run. You don't hide in the cabin. You vanish into the mountain. It will protect you better than any 4 walls." He taught her how to build a smokeless fire, how to set a simple snare, how to read the clouds for a coming storm. He was giving her the tools to survive without him. The unspoken possibility of his own death hung between them, a cold, hard fact of the life they were now living. Lyra, in turn, dedicated herself to her training. She absorbed his lessons with a desperate intensity. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but now it was tempered with a fierce, burning will to live. She was no longer just a victim running from a monster. She was a survivor, arming herself for the fight. One evening, as the sun set and painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of blood and rose, she finally told him the rest of it. They were sitting on the porch, the air sharp and still. "He didn't just kill my father," she said, her voice a low, emotionless monotone, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "He arranged it. My father was a partner in his timber business. My father found out Croft was cheating the government using fraudulent land claims. He was going to expose him." She paused, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Our workshop, it didn't just catch fire. Croft set it. He locked the door from the outside. I was at the back fetching water. I saw him smile as he rode away." The confession hung in the cold air, monstrous and chilling. Jonah's hand, which was resting on the porch railing, clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. He had known Croft was a bad man. He hadn't realized he was a demon. "He took me in afterwards," Lyra continued, her voice trembling now. "Played the part of the grieving uncle, the benevolent guardian. But he was just waiting for me to turn 18, so he could marry me off to one of his cronies and secure my father's share of the inheritance for good. When I refused, when I told him I knew what he did, that's when he decided I was troubled in the head. That's when I knew I had to run." She finally looked at him, her blue eyes dark with a pain that was too vast for her young face. "There is no reward for my return, is there?" she asked. "Not a living return." "No," Jonah said, his voice like stone. "He's not a man who leaves witnesses." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The last of the sun's light faded, and the stars began to prick the deep purple of the sky. The truth, in all its ugliness, was now laid bare between them. Jonah looked at the girl beside him, this child who had endured so much, and a cold, protective rage settled in his heart. It was the kind of rage he hadn't felt since the fever had taken his family, a righteous fury against the senseless cruelty of the world. "He made a mistake," Jonah said, his voice a low growl that was more dangerous than any shout. "What mistake?" Lyra whispered. "He let you live," Jonah said, "and he let you find me." In that moment, Lyra understood. Jonah wasn't just offering her shelter anymore. He was offering her vengeance. He was offering her justice. The mountain was his fortress, and he was its unyielding guardian. And Silas Croft, in his greed and arrogance, had just declared war on a man who had nothing left to lose, and therefore was the most dangerous man of all. They didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, a lone rider appeared on the trail below. It wasn't Croft. It was a local man from Redemption, a prospector named Filson whom Jonah knew by sight. He was a weasel of a man with greedy eyes and a perpetual stoop, as if constantly looking for something to snatch from the ground. Jonah met him on the trail, well away from the cabin, his rifle cradled in his arm. "That's far enough, Filson," Jonah called out. The prospector reined in his mule, a nervous, ingratiating smile on his face. "Now, Jonah, no need for that. Just paying a friendly call." "I don't have friends," Jonah stated flatly. "What do you want?" Filson's gaze darted past Jonah, trying to get a glimpse of the cabin. "Heard a rumor you might have some company. A young lady, maybe. A man down in town, a Mr. Croft, is mighty worried about his niece." "You're trespassing," Jonah said, his voice dropping a full octave. "I'm offering you the chance to turn around and walk away." "I won't offer it again." The smile vanished from Filson's face, replaced by a greedy sneer. $500, Jonah. That's a lot of money. Enough for the two of us to split. We just give him the girl, and he never finished the sentence. Jonah moved faster than a striking snake. He closed the distance in 2 strides, grabbed Filson by the front of his coat, and hauled him from his mule. He slammed him against the trunk of a pine tree, the impact knocking the air from the prospector's lungs. "Listen to me very carefully," Jonah hissed, his face inches from Filson's, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "There is no girl. There is no reward. There is only this mountain. And if you or anyone else comes back up this trail, you will not be walking down. You will be buried here. Do you understand me?" Filson, his face pale with terror, could only nod, his eyes wide. Jonah released him, and the prospector scrambled back onto his mule, kicking it into a frantic retreat down the trail. He didn't look back. Jonah watched him go, his expression grim. It had started. The first feeler had been sent. Croft now knew where to look. He went back to the cabin. Lyra was at the door, her own rifle in her hands. She had watched the entire exchange. "He'll tell him," she said, her voice steady. "Yes." "And then he'll come." "Yes," Jonah said. "Let him." The finality in his voice was absolute. There would be no more running. The line had been drawn. The confrontation that had been a shadow on their horizon was now a certainty, racing toward them with the speed of a rich man's vengeance. The stand would be made here, on this mountain, in this small cabin that had become both a sanctuary and a fortress. They had 3 days. 3 days before Croft and his men could make the ride from Redemption. 3 days that felt both like a lifetime and no time at all. They spent every waking moment in preparation. They hauled extra water from the spring, barricaded the small back window with heavy logs, and double-checked their ammunition. They spoke little, their actions communicating everything that needed to be said. They were a team, moving with a synchronized, grim purpose. On the second night, a quiet fell. All the preparations were complete. There was nothing left to do but wait for the dawn, and for the men who would come with it. They sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with unspoken fears and unvoiced hopes. "Jonah," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. "Why are you doing this? You could have taken the money. You could have given me to him. You owe me nothing." Jonah looked up from the fire, his gaze meeting hers. The firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing the deep well of sorrow he carried. "5 years ago," he began, his voice low and rough with emotion, "I had a daughter. Her name was Anna. She had your same fire, your same stubborn spirit. The fever took her and her mother within a week of each other. I couldn't stop it. I was helpless. I watched the two people I loved most in the world slip away, and there was nothing I could do." He paused, his throat tight. "I came up here to disappear, to let the man I was die with them. For 5 years, I was a ghost. And then you came. You knocked on my door, half dead and hunted. And I looked at you, and I saw her. I saw my Anna." He shook his head, a look of fierce, protective determination on his face. "I couldn't save my daughter, Lyra, but I will be damned if I stand by and watch him take you." Tears streamed silently down Lyra's face. In his raw, painful confession, she finally understood the depth of his commitment. This wasn't just about protecting a stranger. It was about redemption. It was about a father's love, fierce and unyielding, reaching across the veil of death to protect another child. She reached across the small space between them and placed her hand on his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his touch was gentle as he laced his fingers through hers. "You are not a ghost, Jonah," she whispered. "You are the strongest man I have ever known." He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement, a sealing of their pact. They were no longer just a man and a girl. They were a father and a daughter, forged not by blood, but by shared grief and a common enemy. They were a family, and they would defend their home to the last. The sun rose on the 3rd day, a cold, indifferent eye in a pale sky. They came at mid-morning, 4 of them. Croft was in the lead, his face a mask of smug arrogance. Beside him rode Filson, the weasel of a prospector, pointing the way. The other 2 were hired guns, men with dead eyes and hands that rested too easily on their pistols. They stopped 100 yards from the cabin, a silent, menacing line. "Jonah!" Croft's voice boomed across the snow-covered clearing, a sound of pure entitlement. "This has gone on long enough. Send out my niece, and I will be merciful. I will even let you keep the reward money for your trouble." Jonah stepped out onto the porch alone. Lyra was inside at the side window, her rifle ready. "She's not your niece," Jonah called back, his voice calm and carrying. "She's your prisoner, and you're not setting foot on this land." Croft laughed, a short, ugly bark. "This land, this miserable patch of rock and ice, you can have it. I just want the girl. She is my family's property." "She is under my protection," Jonah stated, the words a final, immovable declaration. "Then you will die with her," Croft snarled, his mask of civility finally dropping. He nodded to his men. The 2 hired guns dismounted, spreading out, using the trees for cover as they advanced. The battle for the mountain had begun. The first shot came from the trees, a puff of smoke followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet splintered the porch post next to Jonah's head. He didn't flinch. He was already moving, dropping behind a stack of firewood, raising his own rifle. His shot was not aimed at the gunman, but at the branch above his head. A heavy, snow-laden branch crashed down, and the gunman scrambled away with a curse. It was a warning shot, a declaration of his skill. Inside, Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched one of the gunmen trying to circle around toward the back of the cabin. This was her responsibility. She rested her rifle on the sill, took a steadying breath, and remembered Jonah's lessons. She fired. The shot kicked up snow right at the man's feet, forcing him to jump back behind a rock. He was pinned down. Filson, the prospector, had stayed back with Croft, wanting no part of the fight. He was there, only to point the way and collect his money. Croft, seeing his men stalled, grew enraged. "Useless fools!" he screamed. He pulled his own pistol, a fancy silver-inlaid weapon, and began firing wildly at the cabin. Bullets thudded into the log walls, a furious, impotent drumming. Jonah used the distraction to move. He slipped from behind the firewood, darting to the corner of the cabin, his movements swift and silent. He had a clear shot at the second gunman, who was focused on the front of the cabin. Jonah fired once. The gunman crumpled to the ground, his rifle falling into the snow. One down. The other gunman, the one pinned down by Lyra, saw his partner fall. He made a desperate break for better cover. Lyra fired again. This time, her aim was true. The man cried out, clutching his leg, and fell. He was out of the fight. 2 down. Croft stared in disbelief, his face a mixture of fury and dawning fear. He was alone now, with only the cowardly Filson for backup. He looked at the cabin, at the silent, deadly man who had just dismantled his hired force, and at the unseen girl who had proven to be just as dangerous. He had miscalculated. He had thought he was coming to collect a scared girl from a simple mountain hermit. Instead, he had walked into a fortress, defended by 2 fierce, unyielding spirits. His arrogance turned to panic. He scrambled back toward his horse. "Filson, you idiot! Cover me!" he shrieked. But Filson had seen enough. He turned his mule and spurred it into a frantic retreat down the trail, abandoning his employer. Croft was truly alone. He managed to get to his horse, fumbling to get into the saddle, his eyes wide with terror. He was a man accustomed to buying his power, to having others do his fighting for him. Faced with real, immediate violence, he crumbled. He was a bully, and his courage was a fragile thing. As he wheeled his horse around, Jonah stepped out from the corner of the cabin. He didn't raise his rifle. He just stood there, watching. He could have ended it. He could have put a bullet in Croft's back as he fled. But he didn't. Lyra came out onto the porch, her rifle still in her hands. She, too, watched the man who had murdered her father and tried to destroy her, now fleeing in a pathetic, terrified rout. They let him go. They let him run back to his world of lies and money. His power here, on this mountain, was broken. He would never come back. The silence that fell was absolute. The smell of gunpowder hung in the cold air. The 2 wounded gunmen were moaning in the snow. Jonah walked over to them, collected their weapons, and used their own bandanas to crudely bind their wounds. "Get up," he ordered. "The walk down the mountain will be a long one. Tell the sheriff in Redemption what happened here. Tell him Jonah sent you." They stumbled off, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. Jonah and Lyra stood together on the porch, watching them go. The fight was over. They had won. They had defended their home. Lyra leaned against Jonah, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. He put his arm around her, holding her steady. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." "We're safe," she corrected, looking up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and a love that was as strong and resilient as the mountain itself. They stood there for a long time, 2 solitary figures against a vast white wilderness, a father and a daughter, a family forged in fire and ice, their quiet strength a testament to the healing power of a shared home. Spring arrived in the high country like a whispered promise. The snow receded, revealing the sleeping earth beneath, and the streams began to sing their song of meltwater. The mountain, once a fortress of ice, was reborn in a riot of green and gold. With the thaw came a new kind of peace for Jonah and Lyra. The ghost of Silas Croft and his greed faded with the winter snows. They learned from a travelling merchant that Croft had been ruined, his fraudulent empire collapsing under the weight of his own lies and the testimony of the 2 gunmen Jonah had sent packing. He had vanished, a disgraced man swallowed by the very world he had tried to master. The cabin, once a symbol of Jonah's grief, was now a place of life and laughter. Lyra's presence had filled every corner, chasing away the old shadows. She planted a small garden, her hands, once skilled only with a carver's knife, now coaxing life from the stubborn mountain soil. Jonah found himself changing in ways he never thought possible. The hard shell around his heart had cracked, and now it was gone. He taught Lyra how to fish in the newly thawed streams, and her shrieks of delight when she caught her first trout echoed through the canyon, a sound that brought a rare, genuine smile to his face. He started. Carving again, not the grim utilitarian objects of his solitude, but small, whimsical animals for her, a squirrel, a bear, a whole family of birds to join the ones on the mantel. One warm evening, they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear, dark sky. Lyra was now a young woman, her face filled out, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a serene confidence. She was no longer the scared girl who had collapsed at his door. She was the mistress of this mountain, as much a part of it as the pines and the stones. "I think it's time for me to go," she said softly, though her words carried a weight that belied their quiet tone. Jonah froze, his heart lurching with a familiar cold dread. "Go where?" "Down the mountain," she said, her gaze steady. "There's a world down there, Jonah. A life. I want to see it. Maybe I can find other family. An aunt, a cousin. My father had people." He understood. She was not a child to be kept forever in his protected wilderness. She had a right to her own life, her own future. But the thought of the cabin falling silent again, of being alone with his ghosts, was a physical pain. "This is your home," he said, his voice rough. "You'll always be my home," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. She placed her hand on his. "But I need to know who I am, beyond this mountain. I need to build something of my own." He knew she was right. To keep her here would be selfish, a cage built of his own fear. He had taught her to survive, to be strong. Now he had to be strong enough to let her go. "When?" he asked, the word a stone in his throat. "In a week." The week passed in a flurry of preparations. He gave her his most sure-footed horse, a small pouch of gold coins, and a new, finely crafted rifle. He drew her a map of the trails, marking the friendly homesteads and the dangerous passes. They worked together, a familiar rhythm, but with a new, underlying sadness. On the morning of her departure, the air was crisp and full of promise. She stood by her horse, dressed in new, sturdy clothes she had sewn herself. She looked like a different person, a young woman ready to face the world. "You'll come back?" he asked, his voice betraying a vulnerability he couldn't hide. "This will always be the way home," she promised, her eyes shining with tears. She hugged him then, a fierce, tight embrace. "Thank you, Jonah, for everything." He held her for a moment, his own eyes burning. "Be safe, Lyra," he whispered. He watched her ride down the trail until she was just a small speck against the vast landscape. Then he turned and walked back into his cabin. The silence that greeted him was deafening. Years passed. Jonah remained on his mountain, a solitary but no longer lonely figure. He was the unofficial guardian of the high country, a local legend. He received letters from Lyra, delivered by passing trappers. She had found a distant cousin, had enrolled in a school in a bustling eastern city, and was studying to be a teacher. Her letters were full of the wonders of the world she was discovering, but they always ended the same way. I miss the quiet of the mountain. I miss my home. Then, one autumn afternoon, as the leaves were turning to fire on the aspens, he saw a rider on the trail. It was a woman, her posture straight and confident. As she drew closer, his heart stopped. It was Lyra. She was older, her face framed by a woman's wisdom, but her eyes were the same stormy blue, and she was not alone. Riding beside her was a young man with a kind, open face, and held securely in front of her was a small child, a toddler with a shock of dark hair. She dismounted and ran to him, her face breaking into a radiant smile. "Jonah!" The child in her arms looked at him with wide, curious eyes. "This is my husband, David," she said, her voice full of pride. "And this is our daughter." She looked down at the child. "Her name is Anna." Jonah stared, his breath caught in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the child's cheek. The little girl giggled and grabbed his finger with her tiny hand. In that moment, the last of the old grief, the final ghost of his past, was laid to rest. The silence of his life was finally, completely filled, not with the howl of the wind, but with the sound of a child's laughter. He was no longer just Jonah, the hermit of the mountain. He was a father, and now he was a grandfather. His family had come home. Have you ever had to be strong enough to let someone you love go? Have you ever found a family in a place you least expected it? The bond between Jonah and Lyra was not of blood, but of something stronger, a shared will to survive, to heal, and to love. Share your own stories of found families and unexpected homes in the comments below. We believe that everyone deserves a place to belong. Don't forget to subscribe, because there's always another story of hope waiting just around the bend.